and loss system that allows our economy to prosper. It's undermined by this whole notion of excess profits taxes coupled with bailouts for failing firms. So, you know, if you look at these bailouts, and of course we're not only bailing out the automobile firms, we're bailing out banks, we're bailing out insurance companies, and so forth, and in the process taking over ownership. I mean, I already mentioned, rather than the TARP program soaking up toxic assets, it's been used to gain federal government ownership over those financial firms. And now the automobile industry bailouts are being used to gain ownership over the auto companies. So we're nationalizing our financial industry, we're nationalizing our auto industry. President Obama proposed for GM to emerge from the bailouts and stand on its own. President Obama proposed that the federal government take equity interest in 50% of GM. And also proposed that the United Auto Workers get another 36% or so equity interest in GM. So if that plan goes through, General Motors would be owned by the federal government and the United Auto Workers. And of course, since there's a close link between the United Auto Workers and the Democratic Party anyway, it looks like GM would then be run by, would be controlled by the United Auto Workers agenda. Not that the federal government hasn't had an agenda for the auto industry already, you know, with its fuel efficiency standards and so forth and so on, but if the federal government owns GM, then they would be in a lot better position to push the federal government's agenda and the United Auto Workers agenda even further. And in his proposal, he proposed that the bondholders of GM would get a 10% equity interest in General Motors. Now, if you look at the numbers, the amount of money that the federal government has put into GM is about the same as the outstanding liability of the bondholders. So President Obama is proposing that with the federal government putting in about the same amount as the bondholders, the federal government will get 50% of the company, the bondholders will get 10% of the company. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that some bondholders have objected to that. Not all bondholders, though, because a lot of the firms who hold General Motors bonds are firms who have received TARP money. And so if you've received that TARP money, and so you're kind of under the control of the federal government anyway, you're going to be a lot less likely to object. So essentially, what's the federal government doing here? You know, the federal government's saying, here, take this TARP money, we'll help you out. Oh, but we're going to take away those assets that you have in those General Motors bonds. Giving with one hand, taking away with the other. And so a lot of those companies that are getting the TARP money are helpless to speak out against this. But a few firms that aren't getting TARP money have spoken out against it. They're saying, we as bondholders aren't getting our fair share out of the GM deal. And President Obama has objected to that. And I want to read you a couple of quotations. These are just from the last couple of weeks. I have to get out my glasses to see if I can find them. This is what President Obama had to say on April 30th regarding some of the people who have objected to the federal government's 50% stake in General Motors. President Obama says, and I quote, "While many stakeholders made sacrifices and worked constructively, I have to tell you, some did not. In particular, a group of investment firms and hedge funds decided to hold out for the prospect of an unjustified taxpayer-funded bailout. They were hoping that everybody else would make sacrifices and they would have to make none." That was what President Obama said. And if you're collecting TARP money and sort of at the mercy of President Obama, it's hard to object to that. But let me read you another quotation. This is Cliff Asness, who is a hedge fund manager, had a response to this. Here's what he had to say in response. Let's be clear. It's the job and obligation of all investment managers, including hedge fund managers, to get their clients the most return they can. They are allowed to be charitable with their own money, and many are spectacularly so. But if they give away their clients' money to share in the sacrifice, they are stealing. The president screamed that hedge funds are looking for an unjustified taxpayer-funded bailout. That's the big lie writ large. Find me a hedge fund that has been bailed out. Find me a hedge fund, even a failed one, that has asked for one. In fact, it was only because hedge funds have not taken government funds that they could stand up to the bullying. The TARP recipients had no choice but to go along. The president's attempted diktat takes money from bondholders and gives it to a labor union that delivers money and votes for him. Why is he not calling on his party to sacrifice some campaign contributions and votes for the greater good? Shaking down lenders for the benefit of political donors is recycled corruption and abuse of power.
Hear, hear.
Thanks for the applause. They're not my words. I was reading somebody else's. So look at where we're standing now. You know, I've talked about changes in Federal Reserve policy, major changes, bigger than any policy changes the Federal Reserve has made in any year since its founding. I've talked about the TARP program, initially proposed for one purpose, now gone into federal government purchasing of banks, taking equity interest in banks and nationalizing the banking industry. I've talked about the Obama stimulus plan, that's really just a big government spending plan to undertake the agenda that President Obama campaigned on, and the bailouts, which again, you know, we're rewarding unsuccessful firms, penalizing successful firms, and nationalizing our automobile industry. So you take this all together, and the changes we've seen over the past year have the potential to have as much of an impact on our national economy as the New Deal did back in the 1930s. We're looking at major policy changes that could change the course of American capitalism. I was talking to Bob McClure earlier about this, and he said I ought to have something optimistic to say. And actually, perhaps a little bit perversely, I do have some optimism because I think we've been in similar positions before. I don't have a good feeling about what's going on right now. I had the same feeling back in the 1970s. You know, and Bob earlier mentioned about the big impact the Reagan Revolution had. But you go back and you look at the 1970s. Look at the situation we were in there. We had economy-wide wage and price controls put on early in the decade. Some of those price controls stayed all the way up until Reagan took office. We had price controls in the energy market and on gasoline. If you were around then, you may remember waiting in line at the gas stations to get gas. You might remember when President Carter campaigned in 1976, one of the things he used in his campaign was the misery index, which is, I'm not sure how much economic science is in this, but it's the sum of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. That was his misery index. 4 years later, when he was running for re-election, inflation was higher than when he took office, and unemployment was higher than when he took office. And of course, you may remember our hostages were being held in Iran, as you remember if you're as old as I am. So there are a lot of, you know, you go back to the 1970s, you know, I didn't have a very good feeling about what was going on in the 1970s either. And I didn't even mention other 1970s innovations, disco music, polyester leisure suits. So it's really, you know, not that much. But we turned things around. I mean, and I think a lot of it was the power of ideas.